Here we're going to talk briefly about the most tested topics on the Michigan bar exam. Not all subjects are tested equally, and neither are all topics within each subject. So for each subject, you want to focus on the highly tested areas of law. For most of the essay questions that you will see on the bar exam, they'll test something that has been tested before. The Michigan Board of Law Examiners does not reinvent the wheel. So what we're going to do is go through a brief overview of the highly tested topics within each Michigan bar exam subject. Please follow along. I'm not going to read this handout word for word. I'm just going to point out a few things about the subjects so that you can follow along and take notes. Really what I want this to be is a good reference tool for you as you study for the bar exam so you can make sure you're studying efficiently and effectively and you're not wasting any time. Okay, so we're going to start with criminal law. Criminal law questions like to test homicide, aiding and abetting, and robbery. For homicide, make sure that you're able to articulate the difference between first-degree murder and second-degree murder, because oftentimes these questions will ask you to apply the law and determine which level of murder the defendant should be charged with. This has not only been tested recently, it has also been frequently tested historically. It's one of the favorite topics to test. For robbery, note that Michigan law differs from common law, so you should be familiar with how Michigan law is different. They will test this Michigan distinction. So the law that you learn for the MBE will be different than the law that you have to memorize and articulate on the essay question. Also keep in mind that criminal law does change in Michigan. So some of the older essays will have incorrect law on them. Like if you're doing essay questions from 2004 or before, you might be reading incorrect law. I would recommend that when you practice criminal law essay questions, you start with the most recent exams. The other good thing about starting with recent exams is you'll notice some topics that are covered that might not be covered by your commercial course. Like for example, the February 2016 bar exam covered crimes not taught by most courses, like fleeing and eluding, felony firearms statute, felon in possession, carrying a concealed weapon, carjacking. So the best way to become familiar with these, even though they're not highly tested, is to review recent essay exams. That way you'll be prepared if you see it come up on your exam. Criminal procedure tends to test fact patterns based on recent case law. Frequently, these questions test search and seizure and Miranda, and also the confrontation clause has come up recently. For the confrontation clause, note that this is considered to be a criminal procedure or constitutional law question, but not really an not really a evidence question. Some examinees will start their essay with, "This is an evidence question." And it's not. It's a constitutional law question or a criminal procedure question. Typically, the question will ask you what the constitutional problem with admitting a statement is. That should tip you off that they're probably testing the confrontation clause. For contracts, students tend to have a harder time with contracts questions, and the grader tends to be tough, especially in recent years. Pay close attention to the call of the question. These are often long questions and they're difficult questions. Unlike in criminal law, Michigan distinctions are not typically tested in contracts, so that's one good thing. You'll be applying the same law that you learned for the MBE to these essay questions. One thing to note is that one of the favorite topics that the Michigan Board of Law Examiners tests is contract formation, but don't talk about it if it's not an issue. Some students have canned responses that they put at the beginning of every single contract's essay answer, and they spend literally a half a page or more discussing contract formation when the question clearly states that a contract was formed. So please keep this in mind. You don't want to waste your time. The grader's not even impressed by it. Some people think, oh, the grader will be impressed if I know this. The grader's not. They just scan past it all. It's all fluff, and you're not getting points for it. Another tip is to pay close attention to the call of the question in contracts. Most examinees have trouble with issue spotting and also the arguments that the parties make. Lastly, I'd also recommend that you pay close attention to any quoted language, especially if the contract itself is quoted. Oftentimes, issues are presented by the language itself. Sales. This was not tested as much recently as it has been in the past because typically, if secured transactions, negotiable instruments, or creditors' rights is tested, then sales is not tested. However, it's still game, and the good news is it tends to be a pretty straightforward question, much more straightforward than contracts. There's a few of the highly tested issues listed here. These essays tend to be more, again, straightforward than contracts, so you shouldn't necessarily be sad if you see a sales question. Torts is typically tested. The general pattern is to skip torts if no fault's tested. So generally, but not always, you'll see torts or no fault tested with a heavy preference toward testing torts. The board's favorite issue to test is negligence. So please learn negligence and premises liability in particular, especially duty owed to an invitee. This is heavily tested. It was just tested. You want to discuss duty, breach, cause, and harm. Make sure you're connecting all those dots for the grader, and make sure you're responding to the direct question posed, which often involves an invitee. Governmental immunity is also tested. Not all courses teach governmental immunity. So make sure that you review some of these past essay questions where it comes up, because I would not be surprised to see it again. The favorite intentional torts to test are assault and battery. Recently, false imprisonment was tested, but really they tend to stick to assault and battery by and large. Of course, you don't want to ignore anything. One thing to note is that you want stellar rule statements and you want to apply this methodically, because if something like assault and battery is tested, because it's considered to be an easier topic, typically the grader is a little bit harder on students and examinees. So typically they'll expect a good rule statement and a great application and just a very smooth essay, because this is considered to be an easier topic to test. Evidence. It should be no surprise that hearsay is one of the favorite evidence topics to test. The most common exceptions and exclusions tested are excited utterance, present sense impression, and party admission. Recently, the examiners have also frequently tested former testimony and the business records exception, so be aware of those as well. The examiners like to test convictions for impeachment. In fact, this is their favorite Michigan distinction to test in evidence. So please make sure that you know the difference between Michigan law and the law that you're going to learn for the MBE, because they are different and the examiners test the distinctions. For constitutional law, it should be no surprise that free speech is heavily tested. I would look at commercial speech from the July 2012 essay question. I'd also look at school speech from the February 2017 question, just in case these are repeated. The Equal Protection Clause has historically been a favorite, though it has not been tested recently. And the Dormant Commerce Clause has been a favorite. I would not be surprised if it came up. Please review the July 2014 exam for a good example of the Dormant Commerce Clause. The past couple of bar exams, including the July 2020 exam, have been kind of random. The July 2020 exam tested a due process, void for vagueness issue in kind of a strange way, and a lot of examinees struggled with it. What I recommend you do if you see an unusual question is write a long answer. Do not just write a sentence or two, because if you do that, you will get a point or maybe 2 points, but that's it. If you write a long essay answer, even if you're unsure of the law, even if what you say is not what is said in the examiner's analysis, there is a decent chance that you can still convince that grader to give you 4 or 5 points. It's like an A for effort, okay? The grader doesn't want to give everyone a 1 or a 2 on an essay question. And so typically, if the essay is really hard or random, like they tend to be in con law questions, the grader will give a few more points if you at least attempt to answer the question. Of course, they're not obligated to, but no one's going to complain about getting some points they don't deserve. Okay, real property. This tends to be a difficult question, but it's predictable. Review past essays. They like to test the race notice statute, easements, and fixtures. Students struggle with real property just because they struggle with it in general. They struggle with it on the MBE. It tends to be their least favorite subject. But you can actually do pretty well in the Michigan Bar Exam essay question, even if you don't love real property. And the way to do that is to review past essays and make sure you're familiar with these highly tested areas of law. Civil procedure. Subject matter jurisdiction is tested, personal jurisdiction is occasionally tested, and these motions for summary disposition tend to be tested a lot. Make sure you also review case evaluation. This was tested in February 2017, February 2011, and February 2007. Commercial courses don't always cover it, so that's why I'm telling you to review it, even though it's not highly tested. The February 2007 essay question has a great example and a great overview of how the case evaluation process works in Michigan, so I'd recommend you start there. Domestic relations or family law. 6 issues are tested pretty repeatedly, and we've listed them here. In recent years, the domestic relations question has been tricky and nuanced, and the key is to pay close attention to the call of the question, because sometimes students will assume something's being tested and it's not, and then they write a beautiful analysis but don't get any points for it. So make sure that you review these past essay questions, especially recent ones, and that you pay close attention to what is actually being asked of you. Personal property, these questions tend to be easy. You should get a 9 or a 10 on this, honestly. Gifts, lost and mislaid property, and bailments are the 3 topics that are repeatedly tested over and over again. Please review these areas of law and review past essays. Corporations. People struggle with this, especially those who have not taken corporations in law school. Make sure that you get a good, bigger picture of what a corporation is and the role of directors and shareholders. Try to become familiar with the vocabulary. That's the best way to quickly learn this subject. Fiduciary duties, such as duty of care and duty of loyalty, are typically tested, or I should say heavily tested. The business judgment rule is heavily tested. Review past essays because this subject has come up a lot even recently. Workers' compensation, this used to be tested a lot, which is actually very unique to Michigan. Most states do not test workers' compensation a lot. The reason it was tested frequently is because the members of the board were by and large workers' comp attorneys and judges. At one point, I think at least 3 of the 5 of them practiced workers' comp to some degree. Now, none of them are. So this subject is not tested as much now. It used to be tested every exam. Now it's tested basically every other exam. Professional responsibility. This has not been tested since July 2016, and the board members have said it wouldn't be. They told law schools they were not testing it because they realized that every examinee has to pass the MPRE, and so far they've kept their word. It has not been tested. But as of today, they have also not changed the Michigan rule. Professional responsibility is still listed as a subject that examinees have to know, so technically it's fair game. I would review the outline, I would review some past essays, I would not go crazy with this subject because honestly, you probably will not see it. Again, you don't want to ignore it, and you don't want to, not study it altogether, which some people do, and that's a bad idea because it could come up. But I also wouldn't allocate a lot of time to it in comparison with the subjects that you'll see, like evidence, for example. Wills or trusts. Typically, wills is tested or trust is tested. Typically, both are not tested. Wills tests a variety of issues like validity of a will and holographic will. This has been much more popular recently. It also tends to be a pretty straightforward question, at least in recent years, so make sure you're reviewing these recent essay questions. Trust questions tend to be more predictable. They frequently ask whether a valid trust is created, so you should know the requirements of a valid trust, including the validity of a testamentary trust, an oral trust, a pet care trust, things like that. It has not been tested as frequently as wills, but it was just recently tested in July 2020, which, by the way, had a very similar issue as the July 2012 exam. That's why it's important to complete past essays, because oftentimes you'll see similar issues tested in similar ways. Less tested topics. Agency, this has been tested a lot more recently. It's actually typically a pretty straightforward question. The best thing you can do is learn these areas of law like actual and apparent authority. This is just tested constantly on the Michigan bar exam. It's pretty easy, so it doesn't hurt to spend a few minutes to learn this. Some students, I just saw this on a recent exam where someone wrote, I didn't get to this subject, please don't dock too many points, and they wrote this whole sob story for this agency question. Don't do that, review agency. It has been recently tested very frequently. It's very likely that you could see it come up. And then you won't have to be tempted to write a sob story to the grader. Because, by the way, the graders aren't really impressed by sob stories on Michigan bar exam essays. Creditors' rights, please review this. You can see it's come up a lot recently. Some courses don't teach garnishments. So if your course does not teach garnishments, make sure that you're reviewing it on your own. And I would start by looking at these past essays. Conflicts of law. This is an issue when the question asks which state's law applies. If the question is, does federal or state law apply? Conflict of laws is not being tested. Instead, that would be an Erie issue. I don't anticipate Erie coming up since nobody likes it and it hasn't been tested since 1997. But I could be wrong and it's still fair game on the MBE, so please review it. If the question is which court should hear the case, it could be a subject matter jurisdiction issue. Conflict of laws is an issue when it explicitly says there is a choice of law issue or it asks which state's law applies. And typically they will test contracts issues or torts issues. So they'll test choice of law in a contracts or torts issue. Make sure that you know the test that applies to each one. Commercial paper and negotiable instruments. This subject was only tested in July 2019 and February 2010. This is why you don't want to ignore anything, because here there was a 9-year gap and then it was tested. Nobody thought it was going to be tested in July 2019. I didn't think it was going to be tested. But again, it was. The good news is in 2019 when it was tested, it was actually half salesy, and you could have still scored high without really knowing the subject very well. But that doesn't mean that future examinees will be so lucky. So make sure you're reviewing these essays and that you're familiar with the basics of negotiable instruments. Partnership has not been tested much recently or historically. It's one of the least tested subjects. Please review it though, because it is due time to come up and it's not a difficult subject. Equity. In the last 4 bar exams, this subject was tested 3 times, and guess what? The exact same topic has been tested all 3 exams, yet people still ignore this subject and this topic. It is an easy score of 10 for literally memorizing 4 factors and knowing how to apply them. It baffles me that people do not learn this topic, preliminary injunctions, when it has been tested so much. And in fact, I think the examiners keep testing it because they realize people just aren't reviewing it. And it's an easy question to write and it's an easy essay to grade. So make sure that you review these 4 preliminary injunction factors. No fault has not been tested as much. Recently, it's been in the news due to revisions to the No Fault Act. However, many of the revisions involve law that's not really tested on the Michigan bar exam. This subject should be on your radar though. It could definitely be coming up. In secured transactions, to many examinees, relief has actually been tested less recently. This is a hard subject if you did not take it in law school because the vocabulary will be new to you. I didn't take it in law school, so I understand examinees that are in that position. One thing that's important to do is become familiar with the basics and the vocabulary. Some courses go into a lot of detail regarding things like classifying intangibles and things like that. And in reality, it is generally the basics that are tested. Know the general principles of attachment and perfection. Know what a PIMSY is and how to recognize it and the law that applies to it. Look at recent exams and you will see what I mean. So this is just an overview of the highly tested topics on the Michigan bar exam. Of course, you don't want to confine your studying to only reviewing these topics. You want to review the subject as a whole. But if you want to study efficiently for the Michigan bar exam, focus on the highly tested topics. This is the best way to maximize your points for your study time.